Welcome back to Still Unanswered. I'm Erin Calloway. Today, we're going to Villisca, Iowa, a small railroad town on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy line, where on the night of June 9-10, 1912, 8 people were murdered in their beds with an axe. 8 dead. No definitive answers. That's our episode. The Villisca Axe Murders, 8 dead, no answers.
I'm Marcus Llewellyn. Thanks, Erin. I want to start by rooting us in that place and time. Small, agriculture-based Midwestern community, churches at the center of social life, everybody knowing each other. It's the kind of town where a mass killing was almost unthinkable.
Yeah. Villisca in 1912 had that rail lifeline, bringing in goods, news, and, crucially, strangers. But still, people trusted one another, doors often left unlocked. So when that ordinary Sunday night turned into a carnage scene, the shock was profound.
By the way, the victims were not anonymous. Josiah B. Joe Moore, 43, ran a John Deere dealership and hardware, Moore Implement Company. Sarah Moore, 39, was devout and active with the Presbyterian Church. Their children, Herman, 11, Katherine, 10, Arthur Boyd, 7, Paul, 5. And the Stillinger sisters, Lena, around 11 or 12, and Ina, 8. 2 families connected by a last-minute sleepover after a church program.
That Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, so ordinary, so proud, was the last place many townspeople saw them alive. The program ran from roughly 8 to 9:30 that evening. Sarah coordinated it, the Moore children performed, and Katherine invited the Stillinger girls to stay over. It's one of those tiny, terrible decisions you keep thinking of, if only.
Right. They returned home between about 9:45 and 10 p.m. The house, 508 East 2nd Street, a 2-story frame house built in the late 1860s. The Moores had arranged sleeping places. The Stillinger girls in a twin bed downstairs in the sewing/parlor room, the Moore children together upstairs, and Josiah and Sarah in the master bedroom. It was an ordinary domestic setup.
And then, sometime around midnight to 2 a.m., some estimates extend to 5 a.m., someone moved through that ordinary house and murdered them all with an axe. Blunt force trauma to the head. 8 people. An axe taken from the house itself. No gunshots, no sign of forced entry in the way we think of it.
Let's walk through what investigators and historians have reconstructed. The working theory was that the killer entered before the family returned and hid, waiting until everyone was asleep. There were reports, some disputed, of cigarettes in the attic and an impression in hay in the barn where someone may have watched the house. Those details are in the old accounts, though modern tours dispute some of them.
The trick is to whisk them really well with a little milk or cream and then cook them low and slow. The killer used Josiah's household axe. It was later found leaning inside the guest room, the Stillinger girls' room. The pattern is consistent with several other early 20th century family axe murders. The offender uses an implement found at the scene and often leaves it in plain sight. It's a grim, almost ritualistic thing.
The sequence seems to begin in the master bedroom. Josiah received the most blows. Reports say his face was so damaged the eyes were gone or obliterated. Most of the other victims were struck with the blunt end of the axe. The killer returned to the master bedroom after attacking the children, adding more blows. Then downstairs, the Stillinger girls were killed. Lena appears to have awakened and even tried to defend herself. She had a defensive wound, and her clothing was disturbed in a way that suggests the killer may have staged or attempted a sexual assault.
That detail about Lena, disturbing in every way. Her body was found with her posterior elevated and garments pulled up or removed, one leg positioned to expose her. Early investigators speculated sexual assault. Later analysis could not confirm penetration, but the staging is a chilling sign of a sexual fixation, or at least a twisted ritual element.
There are other eerie elements. Mirrors and windows in the house were covered. Victims' faces were draped after death. A bowl of bloody water was on the kitchen table, and a slab of bacon was taken from the icebox and left near the axe wrapped in a dish towel. Another slab remained in the icebox. An oil or gas lamp upstairs had its chimney removed and the wick turned down low, perhaps to provide just enough light without being visible from outside.
Those signs-covered mirrors, covered faces, have puzzled historians. Are they ritual? Are they a sign of a disturbed offender with particular shame or remorse? Or simply a killer trying to erase reflections so outside observers couldn't see movement? It's haunting to imagine someone methodically moving through a sleeping household doing those things.
The next morning, Mary Peckham, a neighbor, noticed the house was strangely quiet around 7 a.m. She knocked and, finding no answer, let the Moore chickens out and summoned Josiah's brother, Ross, who had a key. Ross entered and found the Stillinger girls in the downstairs room. He backed out and called the town's peace officer, Henry Hank Horton. That's when the scene unraveled into chaos.
Chaos is the right word. Once the peace officer called for help, word spread with an all-call from the telephone office. Townspeople flooded the house, hundreds of people by some accounts, trafficking through rooms, touching items, taking souvenirs. Some reportedly took pieces of Josiah's skull. The scene was contaminated almost immediately, a catastrophic loss for any potential forensic evidence.
The coroner, Dr. Lindquist, was furious. He arrived and urged the sheriff to bring in the National Guard to restore order. By mid-morning, they'd set up a perimeter. But the damage had been done. Bodies weren't removed until late that night, and the makeshift morgue was the fire station. Forensics then were rudimentary. Fingerprinting existed but wasn't standard in rural Iowa. Blood typing was in its infancy. DNA didn't exist. So the combination of contamination and limited science left investigators with almost nothing to pin on a suspect.
Exactly. And then you add media pressure. Newspapers from Des Moines, Omaha, Chicago, national papers, an entire sensation about an axe fiend. People began sleeping with weapons, bolting doors that had been left open for decades. The whole region went on edge. That pressure and the desire for someone to be punished shaped how the investigation unfolded. That pressure and the desire for someone to be punished shaped how the investigation unfolded.
Which brings us to the suspects. The case never produced a definitive perpetrator, but several names dominated the headlines and later analyses. We should take each in turn. Erin, do you want to start with Reverend George Kelly?
Sure. Reverend George Jacoby Kelly was a traveling Presbyterian minister, originally from England, described in contemporary reports as eccentric and mentally unstable. He attended the Children's Day program the night of June 9th and left town on a train early the next morning, according to some accounts. He later wrote obsessive letters about the case, and notably, in 1917, he was arrested and charged after allegedly confessing.
Kelly's confessions were inconsistent, and, importantly, the defense argued he was mentally unstable and easily coerced. His first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial resulted in acquittal. No physical evidence tied him to Villisca. So you have a man who was present, who behaved oddly, who may have confessed under pressure, and yet the court system didn't find the confession reliable.
It's one of those classic issues in early 20th century cases, a confession that may have been coerced, and juries split along lines of whether eccentricity equals guilt. People then, as now, confuse odd behavior with dangerousness. Kelly's presence in town and interest in the crime made him a convenient focus, but the evidence was thin.
Another major theory implicates Frank F. Jones, a rival businessman and later state senator. Josiah had formerly worked for Jones before starting his own competing implement business. There was local gossip of bad blood. Jones resented losing accounts. Private Detective James Newton Wilkerson championed a theory that Jones hired an itinerant killer, possibly William Blackie Mansfield, connecting Villisca to other axe murders on the rails.
Right. The Jones-Mansfield theory gives us a motive, business rivalry, and a mechanism, hiring someone. Mansfield had been linked by some to axe murders in Colorado Springs, Piola, and Ellsworth, and Wilkerson believed Mansfield could have traveled by rail to Villisca, but there's no direct evidence tying Jones to paying a killer, and Jones was politically powerful, which complicated any prosecution.
Wilkerson's work was influential and also controversial. Private detectives at the time sometimes had agendas and could push narratives that fit their theories. The lack of solid proof and the reliance on circumstantial connections make Jones a compelling suspect to talk about, but not one we can say was proven.
There's also Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, who was convicted in 1912 of killing his mother and grandmother with an axe in Columbia, Missouri. Some officials wondered whether he might have been involved in other axe murders that year, including Villisca. But that never gained traction. The link is mostly a shared weapon and the broader phenomenon of family axe murders at the time.
Which brings us to the broader pattern and the modern interpretation advanced by Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James in The Man from the Train. They argue there was an itinerant serial killer, a man they call Paul Mueller or similar, responsible for a spate of family axe murders across the country. Their thesis highlights commonalities: houses near railroad tracks, attacks around midnight, use of a household axe, usually with the blunt end, victims' faces and windows covered, and sexual fixation on a pubescent girl in the household. Villisca fits many of those markers.
I'm careful with that theory, partly because it's a modern pattern read backward, but it is persuasive in some ways. Villisca matches the pattern: rail line, blunt side of the axe used on most victims, faces and windows covered, memory of a sexual element focused on Lena. James and James argue that the lack of interstate communication at the time let a mobile killer move between jurisdictions without detection.
And that's critical. Police forces then were local and often parochial. There was no national database, no coordinated task force, no easy method to link crimes across state lines. So a traveling killer on the rails could plausibly attack in several towns and leave a near-identical signature without being traced.
But it's also important to weigh that against alternate explanations. Could Villisca have been a single local act of revenge, or a one-off psychopath living nearby? The overkill on Josiah suggests personal anger, but the sexual staging of Lena points in a different direction. There's no single theory that neatly explains every element.
We should also talk about the investigation's concrete failings. The crime scene contamination within hours removed the chance to collect fingerprints, footprints, or other trace evidence. No crime scene photography was made. An offer by a local druggist was rebuffed as too ghoulish. Bodies didn't leave the house for many hours. All of that meant the investigation started on the back foot.
And the coroner's inquest on June 11, with 13 witnesses, produced no named suspect. The inquest framed the killings as likely committed by a single person familiar with the house or town, but that's a broad conclusion. From there, rumors and sensational newspapers filled the vacuum.
Politically, the pressure to solve the case likely skewed decisions. When you have a community demanding answers, prosecutors may latch on to a suspect to show progress. That may explain part of the aggressive pursuit of Kelly and the private detective efforts targeting Jones. But again, no conviction stuck.
We should pause and reflect on the victims for a moment. These were real people. Josiah and Sarah, their children Herman, Katherine, Boyd, Paul, and Lena and Ina Stillinger. They had a routine, church, neighbors, a life. Reducing them to grisly details or a ghost story risks losing sight of that humanity.
I agree. When telling this story, we have to balance the morbid curiosity with respect. That's also central to the debate around the house itself, which, after decades of changing ownership and disrepair, was purchased on New Year's Eve 1994 by Rick and Vicki Spragues, later managed by Darwin and Martha Lynn, and restored to its 1912 appearance. It's on the National Register of Historic Places since December 1, 1997. Today, it's a public historic site, a tourist destination, and, yes, an overnight rental.
And that's an ethical knot. The house draws true crime fans, paranormal investigators, and casual tourists. Some locals appreciate the economic boost. Others say it's exploitative to let people sleep where children were murdered. Is it honoring memory by preserving the site or commodifying tragedy? It's not an easy question.
The paranormal layer complicates it further. Since the 1990s, hundreds of visitors and many ghost hunting groups have reported shadow figures, disembodied voices, sometimes a child's voice calling "Dad," EVPs, objects moving, and children seen playing under beds in what people call the dark room. Investigators use EMF meters, infrared cameras, Ovilus devices, and other gadgets to try to detect anomalies.
Which brings us to a truly bizarre episode. November 2014. A 37-year-old paranormal enthusiast from Wisconsin brought a hunting knife, despite warnings not to, and stabbed himself in the chest around 12:45 a.m. He was airlifted and survived. Reports said he later claimed to have seen a flash of light before waking up in the hospital. Authorities found no evidence of foul play. It was treated as self-injury.
That incident fed the house's reputation as cursed. It increased bookings and certainly the lore. But to me, it also underscores another point. Why are we drawn to unsolved, gruesome crimes? Is it a desire for closure, a need to test the limits of fear, or something else?
Good question. We talk about the ethical side because it matters. Tourism provides income, yes, but at what cost to dignity? Some families of victims have mixed feelings. Some communities embrace the story as part of identity. There isn't a single answer.
Let's come back to evidence and theory. If you had to pick one suspect, Aaron, who do you lean toward? Kelly? Jones Mansfield? A man from the train figure? Or some local person we've barely considered?
Marcus, that's a pressure question. Honestly, every theory has serious holes. Kelly had the confession and presence, but the courts didn't buy it. Jones and Mansfield offer motive and a potential hired killer, but no smoking gun. The man from the train gives a compelling pattern match, but it's a modern reconstruction. If I had to pick a theory that best fits the crime scene elements, covered faces, blunt end blows, axe left in the room, sexual staging of a pubescent girl, I'd say the itinerant pattern is persuasive, but I'm not claiming certainty.
I'd say similar. The pattern analysis in The Man from the Train is strong, especially because Villisca aligns with so many of its key points. But as you said, it's a retrospective reading of similar elements. The reality is, we lack hard evidence to close the case. And for the families involved, that uncertainty is its own kind of cruelty.
We've talked about missed opportunities. No photography, no preserved prints, contaminated scene. How different would this be with today's forensics? Imagine a careful, immediate scene preservation, DNA, blood spatter analysis, national databases. Would we have a suspect? Possibly. But the killer or killers may have been careful, or long dead, or unconnected. Pause.
And even modern methods have limits. If the perpetrator was an itinerant drifter who left town and never surfaced in a database, DNA might still fail unless matched to descendants or a prior sample. But it certainly would expand the possibilities. The ability to connect cases across states like they did not is the real game changer.
We should explore one more angle before we start to close: the social dynamics in Villisca. Early newspapers and townspeople often distrusted strangers, but they also had grudges. Josiah had left F.F. Jones's employ and set up a competing business. Business rivalry in a small town can't become a personal vendetta. That kind of local tension can't be discounted as motive for violence.
Absolutely. We need to remember small towns then weren't insulated from ambition, jealousy, and rumor. But motive alone isn't proof. The overkill on Josiah could indicate a personal vendetta. The sexual staging of Lena could indicate a different motive. That conflict is one reason the case resists tidy explanation.
Before we finish, Marcus, what do you make of that bacon detail? It sounds so odd. 2 pounds taken from the icebox, 1 slab placed near the axe, wrapped in a dish towel. What's your take?
It's an oddity, yes. Some have speculated ritual. Some think it's a practical act. The killer took something to eat, then left 1 slab for reasons unknown. It may be a useless detail or a fragment of a disturbed ritual. Without more context, it's hard to use it to prove anything. It does add to the overall picture of a killer who lingered, who moved through the house deliberately.
And deliberate is the word. The covers over mirrors and faces, the lamp adjusted, the axe left in the guest room. These are purposeful acts, not a panicked flight. Whether those acts are ritual, remorseful, or simply part of a psychological signature is where the speculation starts.
Erin, one ethical question I want to toss to you and our listeners. Is it ever justifiable to stay overnight in a house where children were murdered if your aim is historical understanding or investigation? Where do we draw the line between education and exploitation?
I grapple with that. On one hand, living history can help people comprehend the reality of the past. On the other, renting the room where children were killed risks commodifying trauma. If the experience is framed to honor victims and educate visitors, with family consent when possible, it leans toward remembrance. If it's marketed as a thrill, stay if you dare, that feels exploitative. The house's caretakers and the community shape that boundary.
Listeners, we'd love to hear what you think about that. Is preservation and open access a form of memorial, or is it a spectacle?
Yeah. Quick reaction: I see both sides. Some locals depend on the tourism for income. Some descendants want the story kept alive. Others just want privacy and a dignified memory. It's complicated.
We've covered suspects, the scene, the house's afterlife, and the paranormal. Before we wrap, let's return to why Villisca endures in our public imagination. Why do we keep coming back to this 1912 case?
Because it's a perfect storm. Brutal, intimate violence, children among the victims, an ordinary Midwestern setting, a botched investigation, several compelling suspects, and the image of a house preserved in memory. Combine that with the human need for narrative closure, and you have a case that invites endless theorizing.
And because there's an element that resists closure, even with multiple suspects and a modern pattern theory, no one was ever convicted and conclusively proven to be the killer. Unsolved cases often live longer in the public mind than solved ones because they allow us to project fears and hypotheses onto them.
We'll end with a sober thought. The Villisca murders are not just a puzzle for armchair sleuths. They're a family tragedy. Josiah and Sarah Moore, Herman, Katherine, Boyd, and Paul, Lena and Ina Stillinger. They were people whose lives ended in a way that left a small community wounded for generations.
If anything, this case reminds us how fragile the social order can be when violence intrudes, and how important careful investigation and evidence preservation are. It's also a reminder to treat victims and their memory with respect.
We'll link the primary sources we used in the episode notes: Wikipedia summaries, the official Villisca Axe murder house site, the ghost research investigation, and references to The Man from the Train for listeners who want to dig deeper.
Aaron, one last question. If a modern cold case team could reopen Villisca with today's tools and full cooperation from the house, do you think anything useful could be recovered?
Honestly, Marcus, it's unlikely to yield new physical evidence because of the contamination and decades of changes to the house. But there's value in archival work, re-examining old testimony, letters, suspects' movements, and connecting dots across jurisdictions. That kind of historical forensics might not produce courtroom-ready proof, but it can clarify patterns and possibilities.
Good answer. Finally, listeners, we want to close with a request. If you visited Villisca, if you've read a book, or if you have perspectives on suspects or ethics of the site, we'd appreciate thoughtful notes. We'll include a link in the show notes.
Thank you, Marcus. And thank you all for joining us on this somber episode. The Villisca case remains, as we say, still unanswered. We'll be back next week with another century-old mystery. Until then, remember, behind every headline were real people.
Good night.